Welcome to the Gold Newsletter Podcast, your bank of knowledge of investment, economics, and geopolitics. Go to goldnewsletter.com for our publications and archives.
This is the Gold Newsletter Podcast. Fergus Hodgson, your host. All our archives, goldnewsletter.com/podcast. I'm so pleased to be with you and have a brilliant guest with me today. He is the man you go to learn about charter cities. His name is Mark Lutter, founder and executive director of the Charter Cities Institute. And he holds a PhD in economics from George Mason University. And he's been published widely. The Chicago Tribune, City Journal, City AM, and Cato Unbound. Mark, I think we first met maybe 10 years ago in Guatemala. I can't remember. A long time ago.
Probably. Sounds right.
Welcome. And why have you chosen to just devote your life to this, really?
Sure. Thanks for having me on the show. So there's currently about 800, 900 million people around the world living on less than $1.90 a day. There's like 2 billion people living on less than $5 a day. There is a lot of global poverty, and I see economic growth is the best way to alleviate global poverty. So China, for example, lifted about 800 million people out of poverty over the last 40 years through a combination of urbanization combined with special economic zones. And I believe charter cities have the potential to lift tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, to give them better lives, to give them opportunities for the future, for their kids' future, such that they don't live in rural villages without much modern medicine, running water, or in poor urban slums like a lot of them are currently moving to. And so I see charter cities as one of the most, because it is still it's a growing movement, a growing space, but it is still quite small. And so I think it's a place that there is a potential to have a very large impact, just because it has can lead to these huge changes. And right now, not that many people are actually paying attention to it.
Mark, that's such a wonderful outline, because so often I fear or observe that legislators are playing catch up, or they're putting out fires, right? So they're addressing symptoms rather than causes. And this approach of going right to the heart of jurisdictional competitiveness or innovation, crucial. And this is not a new idea, right? So what are the what's the academic lineage that leads to what is now called charter cities?
Sure. So it comes from a few sources. I mean, one, just the idea of what historically might have been called free cities has a long history in humanity. So you have obviously the Italian city-states, ancient Greece. You have the Hanseatic League, which a bunch of free cities in mostly what is present-day Germany in the Baltic region. And then there are sort of two, what might be described as modern lineages for this idea. So one is by Paul Romer, he's the Nobel laureate in economics, the former chief economist of the World Bank. He gave a TED talk on charter cities 11 years ago in 2009, I think, where he advocated a high-income country be a guarantor, basically administer a city in a low-income country. So a low-income country like Honduras might invite Canada to come in, build a city, administer it, with the idea that institutions matter for long-run development. So if you can get good institutions in low-income places, then you can jumpstart economic growth and lead to development. And the city is the optimal unit to do that, because the country is too big and the village is too small. Then in addition to this,
let me just pause you there. Did Romer receive his Nobel Prize for his work on charter cities? I'm guessing not.
No. So his Nobel Prize comes from his work on what's called endogenous growth theory. So historically, economists looked at growth and said, okay, it's made up of basically increasing returns, and you have these inputs, you have labor, you have capital, and then you have this basically residual, which ends up explaining a lot, but there wasn't a clear explanation as to what the residual was. And Paul Romer came in and said, okay, we can basically think about ideas and human capital. And so if we come up with more ideas, these allow, right, an idea anybody can take and anybody can use. And so the ideas they're kind of like they require in sort of effort to develop. Once they're developed, anybody can use them and they spread. And that allows for, explains a lot of growth that was not explicable by the previous models. And so, yeah, that is related to his work on charter cities, but it's not that similar. And so the additional sort of lineage of the charter city space comes from the libertarian tradition. And so you had, for example, forerunners, so Spencer Heath, he was a reformed Georgist, wrote a book called 𝗀𝗻𝗏 Georgism being Henry George, who advocated a land value tax. And so Spencer Heath said, okay, instead of having the government administer the land value tax, why don't you have a private developer build out this area, and then there is no government, there's just the developer, which is semi-analogous to the government, but not the exact same thing. His grandson, Spencer McCullum, wrote more on this.
On what era was this? When was the Spencer McCullum around?
So Spencer Heath published his book 𝗀𝗻𝗏 in 1957. He actually offered 𝗵𝗆 𝗵𝗆, who founded IHS, the use of his, because he was an industrialist, a successful industrialist in the 20s, like the 1910s and 1920s. So he was wealthy. So 𝗵𝗆 𝗵𝗆, who founded IHS, Spencer McCullum offered him use of his mansion in Baltimore, but 𝗵𝗆 𝗵𝗆 decided to go to Palo Alto instead before sometime, I don't know when. IHS is currently in Arlington.
Yeah.
Long libertarian history. And so then Spencer McCullum publishes in, I think, 1972, The Art of Community. And there were several projects in the 1970s funded by Werner Stiefel, who was a refugee from the Holocaust, who and it was a very successful entrepreneur, founded a cosmetics factory and financed. One was Operation Atlantis, which tried to create a new nation in the Caribbean by dredging sand and putting it on a reef. And that was run off by a gunboat from Papa Doc, who was the dictator of Haiti at the time. There was another attempt called Republic of Minerva to basically a similar idea, put sand on the reef to create an island. That was run off by a gunboat from the Republic of Tonga. And then a lot of momentum basically died at that point, and was sort of revitalized by Patrick Friedman with the Seasteading Institute, founded in 2008, the idea of floating cities. This differs a little bit from the conception of charter cities, because charter cities tend to be focused on global poverty, while seasteading, its original sort of formulation, was more focused on pushing the frontier. So they wouldn't target lower income people in emerging markets. Instead, they wanted to think about how can we make governance even better than America's governance. So one of the analogies that was frequently used was America runs on a 230-year-old code, so why don't you update the code? And that's what the seastead is, to attract like software engineers, doctors, very high human capital people.
Right.
And then those, right, like had two distinct traditions that have since sort of merged a little bit, and that's where we are today.
The Gold Newsletter podcast is proudly sponsored by the Discovery Group of Exploration and Development Companies. To learn more about our exceptional track record and exciting future, visit discoverygroup.ca.
Hi, this is Brian London, and we're with our kind of mining few minutes here, talking with one of the Discovery Group companies. As you know, the Discovery Group is a sponsor, proud sponsor, I believe, of the Gold Newsletter podcast. This week, we're talking with Jim Patterson, a longtime friend of mine who is also the CEO of ValOre Metals Corp. ValOre is a PGM, platinum, palladium, group metals exploration and I guess somewhat development company with a great project in Brazil. Jim, can you give us a little bit of a summary of what ValOre is up to in your project?
Sure. Thanks, Brian. Before I go any further, I will confirm we are proud, very proud sponsors of the podcast, and we appreciate being involved with your great work. ValOre is a company that holds about a 38,000 hectare land position in northeastern Brazil, We call that project 𝗵𝗶𝘁𝗃𝗃, and it is a palladium platinum project, or PGE. And we say 2 PGE because there are 2 of the PGEs there represented, palladium platinum. And then recently, just before the rhodium market crash, we announced that we actually had some good rhodium numbers as well in the project. So we'll probably be moving to 3 PGE soon. We announced finally, it was long awaited, that we'll be drilling 𝗵𝗶𝘁𝗃𝗃. We are fully permitted to do so. That's what we were waiting on. We got board approval, and we've laid out in a pretty clear news release. We had a news release on actually the 27th of April that we are going to have 2 phases. The first phase is fully funded, and it's a little under 3,000 meters. And then the second phase is roughly the same, just a little bit, a few more meters. And in both cases, for both phases of the programs, we'll have a mix of target classes. So we'll be looking to expand our known resources. We have 5 zones across the project that make up a little over 1 million ounces at 1.22 grams per ton PG, so palladium platinum. And there are a few of those resource areas that we feel with select drill holes, well-targeted drill holes, we may be able to pull those resources along strike or down dip, what have you, just to expand them. And then there are certain targets on the project that are excellent geophysical target, geochem target, worldview targets, all the targets. In addition, they've been drilled by previous operators and they have mineralized intercepts. And so those are great targets for us, because if 1 or 2 well-placed drill holes are punched into those and they come back and they run, then that's something we would focus on to try to move it into the resource category as well. And then the third class of target is brand new discovery. So there are actually many targets across this large land package that they have all the hallmarks of a resource, they just haven't been drilled. So they have a lot of the characteristics and merits that we look for. We just got to put some holes into them. So that's what we'll be doing as well. So the first phase should start, we're hoping it'll start in June. That's when we're planning. And the only thing that we have to say for full disclosure is that, Brazil is a pretty dynamic situation. We're able to go there in June as it stands right now, but that could change, and we'll be monitoring it closely, and we'll be getting there as soon as we can.
Well, there's nothing unusual about that. That's the way the whole world is right now. So everything is subject to revision with the COVID pandemic. But I think it is important to focus on the fact that you really do have, 3 boxes checked here. You have an established, very large, already world-class resource that you're working to expand. And in fact, that resource was very conservatively outlined. Previous project owners had larger resources, but you decided to be very conservative on that. As a result of that, you have very clear targets that other companies may have considered resources, but you can drill those off and bring them into a resource to your satisfaction. And what's very interesting to me is that you're using some state-of-the-art targeting technology, overlaying some geophysical and imaging technology, satellite imaging technology, to see what the known resources look like, and then expanding that to other target areas, and have already confirmed these other target areas have, at least through sampling, PGM resources. So target-rich environment, lots of opportunities, and news coming up very soon. This is why I've been stressing that ValOre at these levels is a strong buy in Gold Newsletter. So Jim, thank you for that recap. While we have you on the line here, I do want to kind of lean on your expertise as, one of the founders of the Discovery Group and somebody with many years. I won't go into exactly how many years.
More than two.
Yeah, just as long as I've known you has been a bunch.
Yeah.
But, a lot of experience in this industry. We've seen the metals really perk up. We've seen the senior producers move. We've seen some of the intermediate and development companies move. And now at least in the companies that we've been following in Gold Newsletter, we've begun to see some of the junior exploration companies move. What's your assessment of the sector right now?
There are 2 areas that are pretty interesting for me. Gold's obviously one where you can look at the demand and see that it'll be very strong. Some of the operations in the world the supply might be at risk, but the demand is obvious to all that follow the market. The other one where it seems like the demand has been uninterrupted, but I'm not totally certain on that, is the uranium market. And certainly supply has been cut back quite a bit. So you've seen the spot price of uranium move. But on the gold side, it seems to me like it is an absolute no-brainer that the policies of the bankers around the world are going to cause exorbitant amounts of money to be printed, and gold will be worth more in every currency globally. So I'm excited.
Well, in looking at the PGEs, they were really, at least palladium was making all of the headlines before we had all this COVID crisis and everything else. And it was kind of a stealth market. Nobody that I saw, certainly I didn't or wasn't able to predict that it was going to happen, but we had a tremendous move in palladium. And talking with some of the people I've been talking with, the major palladium and platinum producers, the majors seem to be very aggressive or very bullish on the metal going forward, and seem poised to be very aggressive on going out there and acquiring projects. And you and I have talked about this offline and in private conversations. I hope I won't violate anything by sharing them, but I look at the exploration companies in the sector as having maybe a 2, perhaps 3-year window of opportunity to advance their projects and then to the point where they're going to be taken over by the majors. Do you agree with that? Is that kind of what you're looking at too?
Well, I think that it's pretty obvious that the South African producers at least are publicly stating that they'd like to diversify out of South Africa and acquire projects in specifically North America or in the Americas. And with all candor, they haven't said that they were going to make acquisitions in Brazil specifically. So we don't know that. But I think that 2-year window is pretty reasonable, because we've got to do a lot of work on the ground ourselves to expand resources. We have to prove from a general sense that it is a district worth dipping their toe in Brazil, making that investment that is necessary. If you're a major mining company and you want to get entrenched in a new country, it's got to be worth your while. So that's what we'll be doing. There's a checklist of things you need to kind of run through in terms of de-risking to get it closer and closer to the finish line. And so 2 years is a pretty good timeline. The reality, though, is it always takes longer than you'd wished, and it's twice as painful and twice as long, perhaps. But, we have a great project. It's a pretty clear runway for discovery success. And we know how, as a group, we know how to de-risk these projects to move them forward, to make them more palatable and attractive to the big guys.
Well, I certainly agree. I think you fit into that 2-year window like a perfect puzzle piece into the last opening. You do have a clear runway to advance the project. You have lots of targets. You have a resource to build on. And I think you're going to be hitting it perfectly, beginning to generate news, hopefully, if everything works out with the pandemic, in June, very soon, very shortly, and getting ready to get the market's attention. So thank you, Jim. I appreciate your time today. Very excited about ValOre and what's coming up in the days just ahead.
Our goal is elegant execution, Brian. Let's see if we can make it happen. Okay, thanks. Bye.
Right, I'm going to just change the view here so our video editor doesn't get frustrated with me. So we're now on the dual setup.
Cool.
No, so Mark, it is an idea that has an important lineage, just because many of us who've worked in this policy world for a while, we see that just advocating for something isn't necessarily going to bring results, right? So all these think tanks do great work. I'm support that. But two things really do make legislators listen. Competing jurisdictions, right? So if you're in North Carolina and South Carolina lowers a tax or liberalizes something, that really pressures North Carolina. Second, if people actually start to move their businesses and their investment to South Carolina, that also makes them. So this this competition between jurisdiction, to me, is a wonderful, peaceful way of bringing improvements, right, to governance. Now, city, why do we say city? Does it have to be a city? Could it be a rural area? Is that relevant?
Yeah, I think it is. So if you think about what we're focusing on is institutions. So institutions, policies, laws, how those decisions are made that determine long-run growth. But there's sort of a minimum viable size, right? If you take a rural area that has, I don't know, not that many people, then the question is, what do better rules get them? And the answer is probably not that much. If they're just engaged in subsistence farming, then having better laws, right? Like laws require some degree of upkeep. You need to change norms. You need to hire judges. You need to hire enforcers. And passing a better labor law, for example, in an area, or maybe better tax administration in an area where everybody is a subsistence level farmer, is probably not going to lead to a change. Similarly, if you're thinking of a village of like 20,000 people, having better laws, it will make the lives of the people in that village better, but it's not going to change the long-term growth trajectory, right? A village of 20,000 people, even if it has the best laws in the world, is not going to end up super wealthy in 50 years if it's not wealthy today. So
why not? Why can it not become Liechtenstein?
So Liechtenstein benefits to a certain extent, basically, because from the surrounding region. So if Liechtenstein had worse laws, would it be less wealthy? Probably. But if we take Liechtenstein with its current laws and put it in the middle of Africa or Latin America, will it be as wealthy as it is today? No. So, right, like we can think about Monaco as well, right? Like Monaco is to a certain extent a retirement community for wealthy people. And
Sure.
so the laws benefit there, and Liechtenstein benefits from having better laws, but it benefits from it being in this location that has sort of advanced factors of production. But if we think about a village of 20,000 people in Africa, for example, maybe it has the best laws. And maybe it allows it to be a tax haven, and then you get a lot of capital poured in as a tax haven, and it creates a much better standard of living for the people there. But right, like you can only have so many tax havens in the world. Tax havens don't really create wealth qua wealth, right? Like wealth qua wealth is created by by producing things.
Right.
And so if we think about like long-term growth, the question is, how do we create laws that help people produce things? And one of those things is, what is the right unit to apply those laws? And I mean, you like there's some factories that like 20,000 people can fit in a lot of college stadiums, right? It's just not enough people to have these advanced factors of production.
I see. Interesting. Okay, so let's get to the heat of the meat. What is going on in the world today of charter cities, and what gives you optimism that we're going to see some of this lifting out of poverty that, you know, makes us devoted to this idea?
Sure. So I founded the Charter Cities Institute about 2.5 years ago, and part of the reason I founded it was basically because I had been a little bit frustrated going to conferences and seeing the same 5 people over the same 5 years, over the previous 5 years, chat about the same 2 projects with very little progress being made. And so what we at the Charter Cities Institute have a heavy focus on is basically traction on the ground. And we operate in 2 ways. One is a think tank to promote ideas. So we had a conference that was in March, that in South Africa, that unfortunately we had to cancel. We have a podcast, the Charter Cities Podcast. We're coming up with draft legislation, draft charter, as well as a governance handbook. So what does it actually mean to create a governance system from scratch? Then, in addition to these things, we act as a technical advisor, which is basically a consultant. So we are working with 2 projects right now, one in Zambia called 𝗵𝗁𝗁𝗃𝗃. It is a new city, 3,100 acres, being built outside of Lusaka for about 100,000 residents. We signed a memorandum of understanding with the Zambia Development Agency in February, and we were following up, working with them to figure out how to improve their special economic zone law when COVID hit, and now that is unfortunately on pause. So the first residents would have been moving into 𝗵𝗁𝗁𝗃𝗃 this year, but that is also a little bit uncertain because of COVID. We are also working with a project called the 𝗵𝗶𝘁𝗃 Economic City in Nigeria. They came in first place in our Charter Cities Business Plan contest last year. They have acquired about 95 square kilometers. They are building a city for 1.5 million people in 𝗵𝗶𝘁𝗃𝗀𝗽 State. They're focusing on industrial. We helped draft their regulations that were going to be submitted to the Nigerian Export Processing Zone Authority, but that is also on pause. And they were planning to raise funding for stage 1 this year. There's a few other projects. Patrick Friedman, the grandson of Milton Friedman, who co-founded the Seasteading Institute, launched a small venture capital fund called Pronomos Capital, explicitly to invest in charter cities. There is one project that I know in Honduras that is still there, and what I hear is making decent traction. I know a handful of other entrepreneurs in places like Sierra Leone, South Africa, another project in Nigeria who are seriously pursuing efforts, even though they're in somewhat earlier stages. And I think moving forward, basically what we can see is several things. One, there's a lot of momentum happening. There's a lot of people interested. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done, right? The space, I think, is drastically underfunded. So both in terms of investing in the projects themselves or in nonprofits like we are is always helpful. Second, talent. Getting better talent is always important, right? There's interest in these ideas, but particularly the sort of if we engaging sort of later stage talent, people that build successful companies, people that have experience in real estate, experience working with governments. 3, I think looking forward, what we can see particularly in emerging markets is with COVID, the natural resource prices have plummeted. And so there's going to be, this has really hurt budgets. So Nigeria, I think about 60% of their budget is derived from their oil sales. And right, Zambia is a copper economy. Much of their budget comes from the price of copper. And so with the cratering of these prices, these governments are going to be much more open to ideas that they might not have been open to in the past, and much more willing to entertain suggestions like charter cities, provided that they see the charter cities as a viable source for a revenue to sort of diversify their revenue base. And so I think over the next 2 or 3 years, because it's unlikely we are going to have a V-shaped recovery, there is going to be opportunity for the groups that can put together good proposals to get pretty strong concessions from governments to allow the development of charter cities.
Mark, you basically read my mind there a little bit. My follow-up question was going to be, why is now such an opportune time? Why can charter cities flourish in the 2020s?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And to build on my previous point, basically what we're seeing is several things. One, obviously, the low resource prices has created a demand for alternate revenue streams in emerging markets. Second is we're basically seeing, since 1990, the U.S. has been the single global hegemon. And so there was, to a certain extent, I don't know what to call it, not suppression, but there wasn't a lot of space for heterodoxy, right? There was a dominant power.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And new ideas, right? Like when there is a singular power, there is a little bit of, not as much space for new and weird ideas. And charter cities, to a certain extent, are a weird idea. And as U.S. power sort of recedes, and as China with Belt and Road is doing projects that are like charter cities in a number of aspects, there is going to be increasing appetite for projects that 5 years ago would have seemed very much weird and outside the box, that now will seem much more acceptable, both politically as well as hopefully for investors, that I think can create a lot of opportunity in the coming decade.
That's a peculiar blessing in disguise I had not anticipated from, let's say, waning U.S. dominance.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of downsides to waning U.S. dominance too, but there will be some upsides. So
yeah, I agree. I'm not really a fan of that idea, but that's one blessing and that's one silver lining. So, what is the message to, I guess, two groups of people? One, people who actually might look to invest in these projects, and two, all these digital nomad people who want to maybe move to such places. Is there any good news for these two groups of people?
Sure. So let me address the digital nomads first. We have intentionally, I think there will be projects that will have a lot of opportunity for digital nomads. I think there is a move to remote work, and 𝗀𝗶𝘁𝗃𝗽, the project we're working with in Zambia, is explicitly developed what might be called an accelerator, 𝗬𝗶𝘁𝗃𝗽 Academy. They're building a university that will help train people for remote work. It's a lovely location. They have a large reservoir. But most of the projects we're focused on are a little bit larger scale, let's say, just because if you think about remote work, even though it's going to increase, economic development over the past 50, 60 years has always come from industrialization. So China, South Korea, Singapore, et cetera, and nobody's really managed to skip that industrialization phase and go straight to the service sector economy. And because we're focused on economic development, we're focused on the projects that we believe can really scale. That being said, there will be the opportunity for a handful of places to build good environments with remote work. I believe they're targeting that in Honduras, though I'm not entirely sure. And I do know some entrepreneurs that are really focusing on that segment. It's just not the segment that we are paying the most attention to. With regards to your question about investors, I think there is good news. What I can say is call me. I can give you projects. There is an appetite, and my impression is that the terms are quite generous at this stage. So, right, like if you want to help build cities that have a great social mission as well and make a buttload of money, I mean, the analogy is like buying land in Singapore or Hong Kong. Well, like in Shenzhen 40 years ago, or in Dubai 40 years ago, or Hong Kong 70 years ago. So the returns are there. They have long time horizons. And the model obviously hasn't been proven out. It's a slightly different model, but the projects are moving, and engagement with investors is important. So we can help facilitate introductions and arrange projects if any potential investors are listening.
You couldn't get a much better advertisement than that. You are leading the new frontier, and I hope that you're right, that these new jurisdictions will become the new Singapores and Hong Kongs. What a fabulous outlook, right? So the website is 𝗀𝗏𝐶itiesinstitute.org, the whole lot. And any other place, is there any other place we should go to? So your own podcast, just Charter Cities Institute?
So our podcast is the Charter Cities Podcast. You can find it on podcasting apps, and it's also on the Charter Cities Institute website. I would also, for those interested, check out, for example, Pronomos, their Patrick Friedman's venture capital fund. 𝗀𝗶𝘁𝗃𝗽 is 𝗂𝗂𝗶𝗆𝗁𝗀𝗋𝗋.com is the project we're working with in Zambia. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a thriving space. The Startup Societies Foundation is organizing a conference, I believe today, May 1st. I'm speaking tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. Eastern time. So if I don't know when this podcast is going to be released.
Well, after tomorrow, not by tomorrow, but.
So never mind.
Yeah. But otherwise, you'll find all those links in the archive, goldennewsletter.com/podcast. Mark, you've lifted my day. So thank you for boosting my optimism about this. Keep up your wonderful work. Okay. Thanks for your time.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for having me.